I'm Rupert Sheldrake. This is the Science Set Free podcast, and I'm here with Mark Vernon.
Hi, Rupert. Hi
Hello,
there.
Mark. Today, I wanted to talk about the question of how to pray. It's very easy to learn how to meditate in the modern world. There's hundreds of meditation courses. There's mindfulness meditation centres. You can even get a prescription for mindfulness meditation on the British National Health Service. There's meditation centres all over the place, and there's Tibetan ones, and there's Vipassana ones, and all sorts. There's Christian meditation centres, Jewish meditation centres. You can learn Sufi meditation, and so on. And tens of millions of people now meditate. But prayer, which is a different kind of spiritual exercise, is practiced by probably more people than meditate, according to numerous surveys. And yet, I can't think of anywhere where you can learn to pray. It's just assumed that you know how to do it. And anyone who goes to church or who goes to a mosque regularly or a synagogue has a model of collective prayer, because that's what happens during services. But Christians have a model of private prayer in the form of the Lord's Prayer. But there's very little guidance to people on how to pray, what prayer involves. And when I talk to some people about it, they think that prayer is just like sending an email to a kind of celestial Amazon. You know, you put in a one-click order for something that you want, and then it may or may not arrive. So, I mean, that's one way of thinking of it. That's kind of rather crude way that some people do think of it. And of course, there's many kinds of prayer. There's contemplative prayer, which is more like meditation. But in my experience, prayer differs from meditation in a crucial way. I do both. I meditate most mornings and I pray every evening. I think of meditation as more like breathing in. You're centering on the breath or on the mantra, and not thinking about things. And thoughts can come through the mind, but the idea is to let them go, not get engaged in them. To come into a state where it's not primarily about thought, but going into the ground of thought or ground of consciousness itself, which ideally would be contentless. I mean, where you can't be the thoughts drift in and out, or they blow past like clouds in the sky, or swim past like fish in the sea. But it's about not engaging and going beyond to where they're all coming from, to the ground of all thought or mind. On the other hand, prayer, especially prayer where you're asking for things, intercessory prayer where you're asking for things for other people, or petitionary prayer where you're more generally asking for things including yourself, is about engaging the world of the spirit with what's happening in the world. So one is withdrawing from the world and cutting off from the concerns of everyday life. The other is the opposite direction. It's coupling the spirit or linking the spirit to the concerns of everyday life. Praying about people one knows who are sick, praying about problems in one's life, praying about problems in oneself, asking for God's grace and help in all these things. So it seems to me that the lack of teaching of prayer is a great gap. And it struck me that it might be perfectly easy for people to set up how to pray groups or courses, like at a local church hall near you, a 5 Tuesday evening course on how to pray. And it could be led either by a local priest or vicar, or by a lay person who's experienced in praying. And I think a lot of people would benefit from learning how to pray, because learning how to pray is a practical and effective way of connecting to a mind or consciousness greater than one's own. Meditation is practiced by many atheists. In fact, Sam Harris, the noted new atheist, gives online meditation courses. But for an atheist, meditation is about changes happening inside your own mind, calming down your brain, stopping stress, relaxing physiologically, etc. It's an internal process. But prayer by its nature involves relating to a consciousness beyond your own. So what I was thinking is, how would it be feasible, how easy would it be to set up kind of how to pray courses?
Well, I think part of the issue in the church anyway is that the how to pray implicitly is dominated by intercessory prayer or petitionary prayer. Nearly all collective prayers are addressed to God and are seeking some kind of response or blessing back. You know, there are the intercessions during the course of the service where you remember people who are ill and the needs of the world. But even collects for the day, you know, are kind of bidding God for some kind of blessing that's appropriate for the day, or at the Eucharist are asking God to bless the elements. So that kind of dyadic form seems to me to dominate the modern Christian church's life. And I must say I do wonder whether it does us quite a disservice, those of us who go to church, because it so fills up the mind that this is the way to pray. And then private prayers are, as you say, a bit like emails to an Amazon in the sky. You know, I'm rather wary of the kind of talk of treating Jesus as a sort of friend who's kind of alongside you, that you can have a kind of ongoing dialogue with. I don't want to completely dismiss it, but there's something about it which it feels like it gets prayer in the wrong direction. It's at worst serves my agenda rather than opening up my agenda to ultimately God's agenda, you might say. And I guess that's what I feel the meditation side of things has really got right. Or the more usual traditional Christian word would be contemplation. That it's not about changing God's mind, but it's about opening our minds to be more aligned with the divine mind. I think this goes back to the Stoics in the ancient world as well. When someone like Epictetus says, the object of the exercise is not to have your desire fulfilled, but is to end your desire and be open to the desire of the Logos. So when Stoics talked about praying, which it's more or less a good word for talking about some of their activity, that's what they were doing. Whereas we seem to have sort of flipped it around. So any school of prayer, it seems to me, would have to first of all explore the direction of travel in prayer, and I think try and cultivate a sense of reversal. That whilst it's very natural, certainly when you're in a time of crisis, to pray to God and to ask out of your desperation or your hope for someone else that God might do this, we've got to sort of redress the balance in a way and show how even in suffering that we need to somehow let go of our desire and realign ourselves to this divine side of things. The Stoics called it going with the flow. It didn't just mean whatever. It meant really living out of a much deeper part of life, and that prayer was a crucial activity in gradually redressing that balance, turning life around, you might say.
Yes, well, I mean, one kind of prayer would be prayer for inspiration, wouldn't it, or guidance. And in the sense it's a petitionary prayer, it's asking for something. On the other hand, it's expressing a desire and an openness to the greater power of God or of the Spirit.
So would the petition in that case be just the first step to, for example, listening for the inspiration, to be in a more receptive mood? Maybe this is another way of putting kind of what my worry about it is that whilst one needs a prayer to begin something, it's just the first step in a process of openness or listening or receptivity for, say, the inspiration in that case, rather than what sometimes feels to me to be the way that prayer is used now, where you, as it were, ask for inspiration and that's it. That's the sort of the beginning and the end of it.
Oh, well, I would have thought it would have to be the beginning of it. And the inspiration could come either there and then, or it could come through the events of one's normal life, or through political events, and all sorts of ways that it could come.
So the prayer is almost like adjusting your inner antenna, so it can pick up what might be available.
Yes, that would be one way of thinking of it. That would be a prayer for inspiration. You see, I think there's different kinds of prayer, because there's different kinds of being that we can pray to. And all prayers begin with an invocation. Our Father, who art in heaven, come, Holy Ghost, our souls inspire. Hail Mary, full of grace. Om Namah Shivaya. You know, each of these prayers begins with an invocation to the person you're addressing. It's like opening the channel and tuning in. And since most Christians are Trinitarian, I mean all mainstream churches are Trinitarian, seeing three aspects, or technically in the world of the persons of God, aspects or at least of God, then you can pray to God the Father, you can pray to, as in Our Father who art in heaven. You can pray to God the Son, as in Jesus' prayer, or in other prayers addressed to Jesus. Or you can pray to the Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit would be the most appropriate to pray to if inspiration is what you're praying for.
Yes, so you'd be attending to different divine names or different divine realities.
Yes.
And calling on those.
That's right. And of course we have just three in the Trinity, but Muslims have 99 names of God, you know, the Beneficent, the Merciful, and so on. They have many names of God which are aspects of the divine nature. And of course Hindus have many, many, many manifestations of the divine nature in the different gods and goddesses. So this, the kind of prayer, the first thing would be what's it you're praying for or about, or and part of prayer in the collective prayers we have in churches and elsewhere is thanksgiving. It's not asking for something, it's giving thanks for something. So many prayers begin with praise. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. And this is sort of, hallowed be thy name, for God, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. It's a kind of praise. It's an honouring of the one that's being prayed to. So I think there's a sort of a variety of things here, not just requests. But I think that requests, people praying for things they actually need or want, is a very basic part of prayer in all cultures. And I don't think there's anything wrong with it. You know, when I was first living in India, I went to visit some leading Hindu gurus, and I remember once I went with some very serious Hindus to visit the old sage of Kanchipuram, who was considered to be, you know, one of the holiest godmen in South India at the time. And he was sort of frail, almost transparent and radiant. And I was there was a kind of audience, and people were coming up and asking for his blessings, and someone was translating for me what they were asking for. There were all these people almost mobbing him. He was separated by a barrier. But one after another would make their petitions, and it was like, you know, may I find a good husband for my daughter, you know, may our business succeed, we are just opening our new business, and you know, may my son pass his exams, may my mother get better from her cancer. You know, almost every single request was something that really meant a lot to the people who were making it. They'd gone there to make these requests. I didn't hear a single one that said, you know, bless me with divine enlightenment, or help me read the right Upanishads that are right for my spiritual development. They were all very practical. And in the Buddhist temples of Sri Lanka, there's the Buddha looking serene in the centre of the temple, but surrounding the temple are a whole series of shrines to various gods, mostly Hindu gods like Murugan and Shiva and so on. And there, the business is so much to do with what they're praying for. Again, it's all these very practical things. And empirical study would be perfectly possible here in Britain. Many churches and cathedrals have places where you light candles and write a prayer and leave it there. And I mean, it would be perfectly possible to analyse these piles of prayers and see what they're for, mainly. But when I've noticed them, I haven't systematically read them, but they are public. People put them there. One in childish script, please God help my guinea pig get better. Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with children praying for their guinea pig to get better. I mean, they may be disappointed if it doesn't get better. They may think God doesn't work or prayer doesn't work. That's the main downside. But it seems to me that to put these bigger problems, the mundane problems of our lives, into a bigger context is what this kind of prayer is about.
Yeah, it's only human, and also it's those very immediate, intimate problems and desires that are most immediate and intimate to us. So yes. They're going to be the points of contact between us and the divine.
Yes.
But I think for me there is this problem of what happens when the prayer's not answered, or what you do see in the Christian church now is, as it were, piling on the prayers in the hope that somehow you'll persuade God. So you get these websites set up when someone wants to be prayed for, so that there's someone praying for you 24 hours. And it's a slippery area, I think, because whilst I can understand the side of it, which is to surround someone with prayer, so that they're being held in thought, and a kind of spiritual care and containment of issues, I can completely understand that. I think it quickly slips in, or easily slips into, if only we do another 24 hours of prayer, then we'll somehow be able to affect some sort of change. And that does feel to me to be a difficult area, partly because it raises the theodicy questions of why God would answer this prayer or not that prayer. But for me, more profoundly, actually, what it does to our relationship to the divine. It has this vague air of consumerism about it. It's almost like if I pay enough money, then I'll get what I want. If I offer enough prayers, then it'll sort of go the way that I somehow feel it should. There's no straightforward answer to that, because as you're completely rightly saying, what more human instinct could there be than to pray from what's most on one's mind and what's troubling one? But maybe it needs some sort of discernment as well. Another thing which I think that the meditation people get really right about this is that they would stress the need to understand the workings of your own mind as a sort of preliminary part of prayer, so that you can, through meditation, get to know what your impulses are, what your natural thought patterns are, what your concerns and anxieties are, partly for therapeutic benefit, but also I think because then that creates the possibility of part of your mind able to take a step back from those immediate preoccupations, so it becomes more spacious, more open. So then you become more capable of receiving that which perhaps isn't just generated by your own concerns. So it opens you up a bit. But you can only get that if you get to know yourself. And for me, this is why things like silence are so absolutely fundamental and crucial, because it's only in that kind of space that you get to know yourself a little bit better, to start to get over yourself a bit, and then maybe be open to wider dynamics and things that are going on in this space that can emerge in your mind. So I would like to see more of that in the school of prayer as well, the meditation side, but perhaps coupled to openness to God rather than just the therapeutic benefit, which I agree with you, the atheist would sort of stop it at that. I think, for a theist of one sort or another, there's got to be a wider object or consciousness that prayer is ultimately opening you towards. So it's transpersonal as well as intrapersonal.
I think that's of its essence. And in a recent survey done by the Scientific and Medical Network of scientists in Britain, France and Germany, it turned out about 45% are non-religious. And of those, about 15% meditate. So even quite a lot of atheists meditate. About 45% are religious or spiritual but not religious. So almost equal numbers are non-religious and spiritual but not, and spiritual/religious. And of the spiritual/religious, about 20% meditated. Of the non-religious, about 15% meditated. Not much difference. But when it came to prayer, something like 55% of the spiritual/religious prayed, compared with less than 1% of the non-religious. And I think this is where we get the really big difference, you see, that if those who are religious or spiritual have the sense that there's a consciousness greater than their own in the universe to which they can relate, primarily through prayer, because that's the way we relate, like in a conversation or direct opening of a channel. Whereas the non-religious, atheists and agnostics, think there isn't a consciousness greater than their own, so there's absolutely no point in praying. Otherwise you're just echoing around inside your own head. It's nothing but something inside your own head. Now, with meditation, it's okay to think it's just echoing around inside your own head because it makes you feel good and has physiological effects and benefits. But the prayer is much more a way of opening a connection to something bigger than oneself, and is, in a sense, therefore much closer related to other spiritual practices and indeed religious traditions.
Yeah, I think another side to it, which I was thinking of just then, is how we need to bring all aspects of our mental life, our psychological life, to bear on this. And so, for example, another benefit of meditating for me is that it develops this sense not just of consciousness that I'm feeling this, or that I'm wondering about that, or that my mind's preoccupied with something else, but the experience of consciousness itself. So the idea that feelings and thoughts become a kind of vehicle to the sense of being aware in itself, rather than just being aware of this or that. Now, what you then do with that sense that you are aware in itself, that you have consciousness itself, then I think becomes as much a kind of subject for discussion as just pure experience. And for me, coupled to a discussion about the sense that the presence of God makes in all sorts of other aspects of life, to link that to this experience of consciousness itself and start to develop the possibility that it's not just, as it were, my own self-awareness that I'm becoming aware of, but that this might be part of the divine consciousness,
yes.
The flow of awareness that you start to sense, well, maybe this runs through all things. Again, that's this sort of leaping out, taking out. But your worldview, to go back to the research on scientists and atheists and believers and so on, really matters in that. Because if your worldview precludes that, then you're never going to interpret the experience of consciousness itself in that way. And you're going to foreclose it, yes.
Exactly. And meditation, I suppose, can lead to people's expansion of their worldview, because you may reach a point where you feel that this is about a much greater consciousness than just something inside your brain. I mean, after all, meditation comes out of Hindu and Buddhist and other traditions where it's all about relating to a greater consciousness than the human. It's only since the 1970s, really, that we've had this secularized form of meditation where it's all about your own brain and your own self. But prayer's less ambiguous about that. It has to be related to something bigger than yourself. And I think because the instinct to pray is so deep-seated in people and comes naturally to children, that teaching people, even if they're taught to pray in somewhat inadequate ways, it may be better than nothing at all. And churches aren't doing a very good job in teaching people how to pray, in the sense that they're not running courses, and most sermons don't give much detailed instruction. And yet there are techniques of prayer, many of them. And it seems to me that if people started giving how to pray courses, your how to pray course, for example, would have a quite strong emphasis on contemplative prayer as the ground for the rest of it. Some how to pray courses would be much more directly practical. Jesus tells us that if we want something, we ask for it. And after all, Jesus went round with pretty specific prayers, raising people who were dead, and when his disciples said, we can't cast out these spirits from these people, these demons they're possessed by, he said, that kind only comes out with prayer and fasting. You've got to have more effort, more fasting sort of boosts the power of the prayer. So Jesus' example in the New Testament is one of specific prayers and specific healings and praying for healings very dramatic ones, the healing of blind people, the raising of people from the dead, and so on.
I wonder whether the prayer and the fasting is about working on yourself to be more aligned with the divine will, as it were. That the mistake the disciples might be making was too much like magic, and that what Jesus was saying was that, you've got to learn to go with God's flow in this.
Yes. But I think that's clearly the case. And, of course, it's also the case that if people make requests for people to get better, for example, it's one of the more common kinds of prayer, then in many cases it's not going to happen. I mean, after all, if prayers for people getting better worked, no one would ever die. And for that matter, if modern medicine was totally brilliant, no one would ever die. And yet they do, despite modern medicine and despite prayer. So these prayers are obviously not always answered, at least in the form they're asked.
And I'm completely with you on that, taking the instinct to pray really very seriously. I don't think that this is just some evolutionary byproduct that we used to hope the spirit would sort of disappear from behind the shrub on the savannah or something like that. I find those evolutionary stories completely laughable. So taking the instinct as something that's about our spiritual side and our desire to connect our life to more than just ourselves, and then beginning to offer people ways of developing that sense, because it's got to be something that, if it's a sophisticated part of our lives, like every other sophisticated part of our life, it's got to be something that's schooled, as you're saying.
Yes. Well, one way that people learn is as children, and with our own children when they were young, Joel and I, my wife and I, used to pray with them every night when they went to bed. And we started by giving thanks for all the nice things that happened during the day. Then we prayed for various members of our families and people we wanted to pray for and things that concerned us. And they always ended up by praying for our animals, guinea pigs, goldfish, cats, and so on, for God to bless them. Asking for God to bless the people we were praying for and our cats. And so asking for blessings is a fairly generic form of prayer, but works in most circumstances. And we always ended with saying the second collect from Evensong, lighten our darkness, we beseech thee, O Lord, and by thy great mercy defend us from all perils and dangers of this night, through the love of thy only Son, our Saviour, Jesus Christ. Well, that was a very good prayer to end the day with before they went to sleep. The idea that God is protecting us from perils and dangers of the night. It's a protection against bad dreams, against fear, against anxiety when you're going to bed. And so that's a kind of prayer that's not making a specific request. It's not exactly like a kind of email for something or a one-click order on Amazon. And the first collect from Evensong after the collect of the day, which has defend us from the fear of our enemies, that we may pass our time in rest and quietness. This idea that God can defend us, not exactly from our enemies, but from the fear of our enemies, make us less afraid in the way we approach life, because we feel we have God's help and we're strengthened by God's help. These seem to me very important parts of the prayers that we actually pray together.
And what it does for me, because those prayers have been part of my life since my childhood as well, and still now, when you say them, I feel myself just going to a slightly different level of consciousness almost. There's a reason why lighten our darkness, we beseech thee, O Lord. It immediately takes me, as it were, to the end of something. It feels like a kind of resting in God or something like that.
Yes.
And that's very much the incantation side of it.
Yes.
So having these things as part of your life becomes part of a rhythm and a pulse.
Yes.
And helps you through the rhythms and pulses of life.
Well, that would be part of the How to Pray course, including established and long-used prayers like that. In that case, for the evening, for night. And then, of course, there are other prayers for mornings, for the new day. And
I do think these prayers go very deep to the heart of our being. I've heard people caring for elderly relatives who are suffering from dementia, who otherwise seem to lose complete contact with the world, but can still, for example, say the Lord's Prayer or say the Grace. and they do seem to inhabit a very deep part of ourselves, which again I think you must take really seriously. You know, it's not just some kind of tick, but it's connecting our consciousness to something beyond that which gets destroyed by, dementia and so on.
Well, it seems to me that learning these prayers, you see, is something that could be much more general in our society than going to church. Most people don't go to church for a variety of reasons, but there's no reason why more people than go to church shouldn't learn these prayers. I mean, they need only spend 5 or 10 minutes a day praying, or less. Do it less often than daily. But knowing how to do it, I think, would open up for people a channel to God. And that then may open up the spiritual dimension of their lives through starting from their own needs and where they are, rather than from doctrines or creeds or teachings or Bible readings or anything. But starting from where they are and from their own needs. It seems to me a better way of approaching the spiritual realm. I think it has to start practically from where people are.
Yeah, I agree with that. I can completely see that.
Good. Well, I think we should continue this conversation another time and think of ways of, or find people who are able to lead such courses.
Yeah. You're saying it's a very natural, spontaneous human need.
Well, thank you.
Thank you all.